this morning is from Genesis chapter 45, verses 3 through 11. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there'll be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household and ruler of Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute.'"
I'll be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 35 to 38, and 42 to 50. "But someone will ask, 'How are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come?' How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. When you sow, you do not plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or something else. But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed he gives its own body. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being, the last Adam, a life-giving spirit. The spiritual did not come first, but the natural, and after that, the spiritual. The first man was of the dust of the earth. The second man is of heaven. As was the earthly man, so are those who are of the earth. And as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are of heaven. And just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly man. I declare to you, brothers and sisters, that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable.
And our gospel reading this morning is from Luke chapter 6, verses 27 to 38. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold from him your shirt. Give to everyone who asks, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father in heaven is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. This is a challenging teaching. This goes way beyond reciprocity, returning kindness for kindness. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Love all in, the kind of love that Jesus invites us into, calls on us to forgive our enemies. Because forgiving our enemies sets us both free. I don't feel like I've had a lot of enemies over the course of my life. I know sometimes that friends can quickly turn into enemies. When I was young, our family had a schoolhouse for a cottage, a one-room schoolhouse up in Manitoulin Island. And it didn't have any power, and so we used the old oil lamps that came with the cottage to light the place. And I took a liking to one of these lamps. It was an old antique thing, and I shined it up and brought it home for me as a keepsake. I was telling my friend about this lamp one time. I was so proud of it, and explaining, this is an old thing. And he had it in his hands, and then he started throwing it up in the air and catching it. Oh, he's just teasing me. An antique, you say, eh? Well, that's really fun. And wouldn't you know it, his hand slipped, and this antique lamp fell on the floor and smashed into 1,000 pieces. That cooled our relationship for a while. At 11 years of age, I didn't know exactly how to go about forgiving my friend. And as much as this was painful for me at the time, I know this is trivial compared to the betrayals that some of you have likely experienced. Joseph, in our first reading this morning, can guide us in learning how to forgive our enemies. Now, the reading that Suzanne did so well for us drops us kind of into the climax of Joseph's story. And to appreciate its power, we really need to recall the events leading up to that meeting between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph was born into a very dysfunctional family. Some of his brothers were murderers, adulterers. They were deceptive with one another. Joseph was the favorite son of his father's favorite wife. He had more than one, which is always trouble. Joseph had grandiose dreams. He dreamt that his brothers would someday bow down to him. And they hated him. So much that when his father Jacob sent them out to check on the older boys who were tending to the sheep one day, they planned to kill him. He was thrown into a well and left to die, but when some merchants came along, they thought, why not make this a profitable adventure? And so they sold their own brother as a slave. And they told their dad, or they made their dad believe that he had been devoured by a wild animal. And Joseph was about 17 at the time, enjoying the good life of a well-to-do family, dysfunctional as it was, and then suddenly thrust into slavery and carried off to a foreign country. Imagine how devastating that would have been for him. Years later, his brothers were remembering that event, and they said, "We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen." The next 20 years of his life were a roller coaster of ups and downs, false accusations, extended jail time, broken promises. But then through the God-given ability he had to interpret dreams, he interpreted Pharaoh's dream and predicted 7 years of famine, followed by 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh made him the top official in his land to prepare for this famine that was coming. His own family back in Canaan was starving. And so Jacob, in that time of famine, sent his sons to Egypt to buy food. And when they arrive, they meet Joseph. Now, Joseph recognizes them right away. They haven't changed all that much in those 20 years. But they don't recognize Joseph. Joseph has changed quite a bit. He's not that scrawny 17-year-old stay-at-home kid that they sold off into slavery. Now he's a middle-aged man. He's probably put on some weight. He's wearing very fancy clothes, probably a headset of some sort, a different hairstyle. no beard. He speaks Egyptian. He has an Egyptian name. Now, even without all those differences, I kind of relate to the brothers who didn't recognize him. I have to admit, and I'm ashamed to admit, that if I met any of you in the grocery store in Kitchener, I probably wouldn't recognize you right away because I'm used to seeing you here. And when I see you in a different context, it kind of takes a while for my brain to kick in. But that's me. Joseph keeps his identity secret, and he speaks harshly with his brothers when he meets them. He's testing their mettle. And he sends them back home to fetch their youngest son, their youngest brother, whom he has never met. And meanwhile, he keeps one of the older boys in prison while they're gone. And when they eventually come back, he frames his youngest brother, Benjamin, for stealing his gold cup, which Joseph himself had inserted into his saddlebag. And he threatens to keep Benjamin as a slave. But Judah, one of the older brothers, who's actually the one that sold or had the idea to sell Joseph into slavery, volunteers to be a slave instead of Benjamin because he knew it would break his father's heart again to lose this youngest son. So Joseph is witnessing all of this drama, much of it which he's creating. And I'm glossing over a lot of details here. It's a fascinating read. You can look it up this afternoon if you want and see all the juicy details in Genesis 37 to 45. But finally, Joseph can hold back his emotions no longer. And he clears the room so that no one else is there. None of the Egyptians are there. It's only him and his brothers. And then this grown man, this dignified official, begins to bawl. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians who were not in the room could hear him. I wonder if you can hear him over these centuries. What do those tears represent? Was he mourning the loss of relationship with his dad? The pain of rejection? Was he mourning what he could have had with his brothers if they hadn't sold him into slavery? Were they tears for all the wasted years that he languished in prison? Or maybe tears of grief for not looking up for his family sooner? He had 2 sons by now. He named the first one Manasseh, which means something in the Hebrew like forgot. And he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and my father's household. Now, if you named your son Forget so that it would help you forget, I can't help but think that every time you looked at your son, you wouldn't be forgetting, you'd be remembering what you're trying to forget. But I wonder if all those memories and losses and regrets came flooding back to him in that moment and overwhelmed him. He wept loudly. Have you ever been in that place? We're looking back at what you've lost. You just can't hold back the tears. What's Joseph's next move? The brothers have got to be wondering what's going on. This official in front of them is bawling his eyes out. And what are we doing here? And then Joseph drops his guise. I am Joseph. I am your brother. Is my father still living? Now the brothers are terrified, and for good reason. This kid that they sold off as a slave is now the second most powerful person in Egypt, and they're completely at his mercy. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. What does that look like for Joseph? I think there's a few things that we can learn from Joseph about forgiving our enemies. And the first one is simply this. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Joseph doesn't gloss over the fact that he has been wronged by his brothers. He says, you sold me, your brother, as a slave. So he's acknowledging to himself and to his brothers that he has been hurt. Sometimes we say to those who hurt us, it's no big deal. You said you'd be home for supper at 6 and I didn't come home till 8. No big deal. And you push down those resentments and pretend they're not there. but they are there, and they don't go away. And now you've given that person who offended you the impression that it really was no big deal, and so it's likely to happen again. It's more helpful to acknowledge up front the wrong that was done, the betrayal that you felt. Joseph releases his brothers from any sense of obligation to him. What he does not say is, you sold me into slavery, you owe me a year at least for every year that I spent in prison. He doesn't say that. Quite the opposite. He says, come and I will provide for you. So his brothers are free from any obligation to pay him back, and Joseph is free from feeling like they owe him something, free from paying them back with anger and resentment that would be more harmful to himself than to anyone else. Forgiving my enemy actually sets us both free. One thing that helps Joseph to release his enemies, I think, from obligation is a theological perspective. He was looking not just at the harm that he suffered from his brothers, but what God was doing in the midst of all that suffering and turmoil. He says, it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now, this isn't about shifting the blame from the brothers to God for all that Joseph suffered, as if becoming a slave in Egypt was God's plan for Joseph all along. No, that's not right. The brothers should not have sold Joseph as a slave to Egypt. They were guilty of that. They shouldn't have put their father through the agony that they did. But God took this mess and redeemed it, repurposed it to accomplish something good. And if you've suffered unjustly at the hands of others, it's not because God intended for that to happen for his own purposes. That's not the good news. The good news is that God can take what should never have happened and bring something good out of it. And if it hasn't happened yet, trust God that it will happen. That's the hope that we hold on to. What is the theological perspective that helps us forgive our enemies? Paul says in Colossians 3, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, forgive as the Lord has forgiven you. And we may not have committed the same offenses that those who have offended us have committed, but we're not innocent either. We've been shown mercy from God, undeserved favor. So who are we to demand that others pay us back the wrongs that they have done? Abba Moses was one of the desert fathers living back in the 4th century. And there's a story about him whereby a Christian brother was found guilty of something. And so a group of monks gathered around to determine what his punishment should be. And they called on Abba Moses because they respected his opinion a great deal. And they asked him to come to this meeting. And so he got up to go, and he took with him an old basket which was filled with sand, and he carried it on his back. And the monks went out to meet him and asked, Abba Moses, what does this mean? Why are you carrying this thing on your back? And he said, my sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And I have come here today to judge another. Well, these monks listened to him. They said no more to the brother who had sinned, but they forgave him. Joseph also shows us that forgiving our enemies involves seeking their good. He says to his brothers, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Now, we've already seen that the brothers actually were quite distressed over what they had done to Joseph. When they had discovered the money in their bags that they were supposed to have given to pay for the food the first time they were in Egypt, they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother. And Reuben cried out, I told you that we shouldn't have done this. So they're haunted by these things that they've done. These voices of condemnation were likely playing in their heads constantly, feeling guilty over what they had done to their brother. We could call these our exiled parts. those parts, those voices that speak that we kind of like to push down and keep hidden. We don't like to admit to anybody that those voices are there. But they keep haunting us. And Joseph identifies these voices in the heads of his brothers, and he calls them out. I think we can probably identify with those voices of blame and self-condemnation that often play silently in our heads. They're not doing us any good. And when we acknowledge them and bring them out into the open, the way Joseph does for his brothers, those exiled parts can be transformed, because whatever we bring into the presence of Christ, whatever we bring into the light, is transformed. Not only do I no longer hold these offenses against you, says Joseph, but I release you from holding these offenses against yourself. I wish you well, seeking the good of your enemy. It's one thing to release your enemy from obligation, from the sense that they owe you something, but Joseph also shows us that complete forgiveness includes restored relationships, which is signified in Joseph's case by a closing of distance. Before Joseph sends his brothers home to their father for the second time, and before he has revealed himself to them and shows them who he actually is, he has them over for a meal. But while his brothers are seated at one table, Joseph is seated off by himself at another table by himself. So their relational alienation is clearly represented by their physical distance from one another. But after Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, as we read today, he says, "Come close to me. Come close to me." And he sends them home to fetch their father, but he says, "Come back and don't delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen and be near me. You, your children, and your grandchildren." It's not, hey, come and visit once in a while, but don't stay too long. But please, move into the neighborhood for good. This desire for close proximity is a signal that relationship has been restored. I actually want to be around you. Well, Joseph was a real person with significant grievances who shows us what total forgiveness looks like. It acknowledges harm. It releases the transgressor from obligation. It seeks the good of the transgressor. And it seeks to be in close relationship. But is this total forgiveness totally realistic? As we said at the beginning, this is hard. I think we have to acknowledge, first of all, that the ability to forgive our enemies is a grace that is given to us from God. Our gospel reading today says, "If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you?" Even sinners do that. But forgiving our enemies, that is not a natural response. This bears the mark of our Heavenly Father, who is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. So forgiving our enemies is a grace. We can't force it. We can only cooperate with it. But we do need to bring our enemies to the Lord and ask for the grace to forgive them. There are situations far more extreme than my example of the friend smashing my oil lamp, where forgiveness is extremely difficult. And even if you get to the point of releasing your enemy from obligation, it may not be safe to be around them, so that proximity may not be realistic. I think it's helpful for us to acknowledge that when Jesus says in this passage in Luke 6, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you," and so on, every time he uses the word "you" in this passage, "you" is used in the plural sense. And why does that matter? Because the call to forgive does not rest on you alone as an individual. It may be more than you can bear. Complete reconciliation on a personal level may not always be completely realistic. But as a community, we can forgive, we can restore and see healing accomplished. So why is it important for us to forgive our enemies? Why not just give them the cold shoulder that they deserve? No one would blame you for that. Can I suggest 3 reasons quickly this morning? One is, first of all, for the restoration of relationship. What would Joseph have missed had he not forgiven his brothers? Think of the catch-up conversations that he must have had with them in the weeks and the months that followed. The family dinners, playing football perhaps with his nieces and nephews and their children. The freedom to call your brother and say, hey, I need some help this weekend. I've mentioned previously in some weeks earlier a couple of brothers, friends of mine, who used to do everything together, but now they're no longer on speaking terms with each other. Family get-togethers are torturous for them. The loss of relationship, which once provided so much joy and stimulation, support, encouragement, it's not there, and that's such a high price to pay for holding grudges. Another reason why it's important to forgive our enemies is for our own freedom. When we hold a grudge against someone, we give them a certain power over us. It's like we're chained to them by our own expectation that they owe us something. And that expectation forces us to think about them in a certain way and act toward them in a certain way. And we are not free. Forgiveness breaks that chain so that we're no longer bound to them by some sense of debt still owing to us. Unforgiveness turns into bitterness, and bitterness literally eats away at our physical organs and our mental health, resulting in infirmity and anxiety. And this again is a far cry from freedom. A far cry from the abundant life that God is calling us to and that He desires for us. A third reason to forgive our enemies is to bear witness to another kind of kingdom. Jesus said in today's reading, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do good to those who are good to us. We shouldn't love those who love us. This is basic reciprocity, and the world is very familiar with this. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It makes good sense. But when we love our enemies who don't deserve it or may not return kindness with kindness, it turns heads because that is not the way of the world. But it is the signature move of our Heavenly Father, who is, as Jesus says in Luke 6, kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. When we love our enemies, when we're merciful, when we bear witness, then we bear witness to another kind of kingdom in our midst. In the passage that Peggy read today from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells us that there are 2 kinds of people. One from the realm of the earth, the kingdom of the earth, and the other from the kingdom of heaven. And as was the earthly person, so are those who are of the earth. People who love those who love them. People who are kind to those who are kind to them. And as is the heavenly person, like Jesus, for example, so are those who are of heaven, those who love their enemies and are good to those who hate them. And, says Paul, just as we have borne the image of the earthly person, so we were those people that just loved those who loved us, so shall we bear the image of the heavenly person. And more as we're transformed into the likeness of Christ through our willing cooperation in this process of spiritual formation. So when we forgive our enemies, we are witnesses to the transforming work of God in our world. Well, what does all this mean for us on a practical level as we come to a close? What's God's invitation for us today? Well, maybe we could comment just nationally for starters. Recently, our neighbors to the south have been becoming more and more of an adversary. I'm sure if you've turned on the news at all, you're aware of that. And I know we'll need to be smart about how we respond to hostile advances. Maybe booing the national anthem isn't the response of love. It's certainly the response of the earthly person. This week, somebody in Nanaimo, maybe you heard this in the news, somebody in Nanaimo, BC had a more friendly response. And they posted an invitation on social media to come to Nanaimo to their American friends. And they provided directions and places where they could stay. And I think they thought maybe this is just kind of a lark, but it actually caught on. It went viral. And the whole town got behind them. And people started booking hotels for Nanaimo, BC this summer. People are coming all the way from Florida to visit. So hopefully closing the distance will start to strengthen that relationship. Well, what does it mean for me on a personal level? Now, I didn't hand out pen and paper this morning, but I'd like you to imagine just for a moment that you've got pen and paper in hand. And if you actually do have pen and paper in hand, all the better. And now with your pen and your piece of paper, I'd invite you to write down the names of 3 enemies. Could be a work rival. Maybe somebody in your family. Somebody who hurt you a long time ago. Might actually be somebody you get along with most of the time. You got those names on your list. Now let's hear Jesus again. But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Now, if you've been hurt badly, maybe it's too much for you to begin with the first one on that list. To start by doing good to someone who has hurt you. But maybe you could begin with pray for those who mistreat you. And if that's too much, maybe you could begin with pray that God will give you the desire to pray for those who mistreat you. And maybe in time you'll eventually be able to speak a blessing over those people from the bottom of your heart, if not from face to face, from a distance. Some of you may be ready to start on the top of that list, doing something good for someone who hates you. And perhaps you could write beside their name on that imaginary piece of paper the good thing that you could do for them and when you could do it. Wouldn't it be great if in a year or 2 from now, none of those names were no longer on your list because they were no longer enemies? Forgiving our enemies sets us both free. Let's pray. God, sow the seeds of love, hope, peace, mercy, and justice. May they be found growing in our words and our actions this day and always. Amen.